Hi, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is the second in a series of webinars we're putting together that uses our customer profile data to give you a new lens in understanding how customer behavior and needs are changing during this COVID crisis in the telco industry and how you can respond to that. As we mentioned last time, our mission as a company is to make buying without humans feel human. And as we know, the human interaction is becoming more and more of a luxury item. So we're seeing some very, very interesting trends with how customers are responding to that in the digital environment. The profile data we use is captured from our engine, which asks a series of questions to the customer, tries to mirror the psychology of selling as a human does, and therefore gives us this very unique take on how they're thinking, what are their decision drivers, and that's the data we're going to use here. Don't worry if you haven't seen the previous webinar, we're going to recap as we go through. Okay, so quickly on the agenda, we're going to be using our profile data to answer three key questions today. The key here is that we now have 12 weeks of data in which to use. Last time we checked in at our last webinar, we were around the third week of March. So today is really about updating on the trends we're seeing and taking a step back and looking at answering these questions in the whole 12-week period. So the three questions we're going to be answering today are, how is digital performance changing? Obviously, you have your own data in terms of traffic, conversion, and so on, and hopefully we can support that with an industry-wide view. How are customer needs changing across the industry? We picked up some really interesting trends last time in terms of how behavior and needs were changing. We'll update you on those and look at how they've changed. And then finally, how are customers' buying behaviors changing across the industry? So again, last time we saw people were very willing to spend in certain places, and we're going to check in again and see how that trend is progressing as we go through these last weeks. Very quickly on the data we're using, we now have obviously more data. We've got 12 weeks. That means we're using nearly 4 million engine interactions within our data set now, up from around 1.6 million in the last webinar. In terms of the sort of spread of telcos that we're using 7 tier 1 telcos, are partners of ours across the UK and USA that are feeding into this. So like last time, I'm going to hand you over to Emily, who's our lead analyst. She's going to be taking you through those three key questions and the data behind it, and I'll be jumping in where necessary. All right, over to you, Emily.
Thanks, Tom. So we'll start off by talking about how digital performance is changing. So we all know that with Covid-19, we've gone through a significant and now quite an extended period of change, with next to nothing really happening before March, and then a flurry of activity in the middle of March where we were all told to quite drastically change our behaviour. In the UK, very little additional advice has been given since, more than people just to expect more of the same. But for the US, things have started to change a bit more in the last week or so, with just under half of US states no longer having an active stay-at-home order in place. Despite store closures moving customers online, March and the beginning of April was dominated by fewer customers visiting telco industry websites. This changed quite suddenly in the second week of April when we saw COVID stimulus checks in the US, furlough payments in the UK, coinciding with the iPhone SE launch, which all drove the number of visitors back to their pre-COVID levels, where it's now remained quite stable for 5 weeks. These events have created 4 very distinct periods of behaviour from customers, from the pre-COVID period where there was very little behavioural shifts, to the lockdown peak when we last updated you, to a period of lockdown fatigue when customers had financial and product incentives to bring them back onto site, and finally a period of new normal where we're starting to see a similar number of customers each week that we had pre-COVID. Although we saw customers initially declining, sales have been on a steady increase between March and mid-April, peaking at 124,000, an impressive 300% growth on February's weekly sales.
And the very interesting thing here is that new normal is obviously used a lot as a term, but actually there's nothing normal at all around the current conversion rates and sales being generated from the site. So really the question for us is, what happens next? What are we going to see happen next in this new normal phase?
And using our data, we can see that weekly sales were expected to increase at this time with seasonal shifts, but that COVID presented this unprecedented purchasing behaviour where we're 60,000 sales ahead of where we would have expected to be. So as Tom said, where we go from here really could be very changeable. So next we'll come on to talk about how customer needs are changing across the industry. So the first thing I wanted to update you on was customers reaching out for support. So initially we saw the proportion of customers opening the Help Me Choose engine rise from 7.3% in the pre-COVID period up to 9.4% during the lockdown fatigue period. It's fallen back slightly now, but remains far higher than pre-COVID. And even in the US, where we've seen retailers begin to open up stores in the last few weeks, customers are still seeking out digital support more online than we've seen in the past.
And this is interesting because it tends to point towards the customer we talked about last time, which was that customer who may have started in store or may have started in call center. Even though traffic generally has declined back towards relatively normal levels, we're still seeing this more cautious customer, this customer reaching out for help, very much staying online.
And in quite a similarly shaped trend, we saw the percentage of customers entering the engine who were already existing customers of our partners rise by 36% between early March and mid-April, as existing customers sought out support amending plans to deal with their new needs. As lots of our partners began to amend their journeys online to help them find the support elsewhere, we began to see this tail off a little, but it remains far higher than pre-COVID levels.
And this is a slightly good news story because we have seen, as Emily said, in our partners, some really good projects happen very quickly, actually, of putting up specific COVID information, answering people's questions online much better. So actually, where customers were seeing our Help Me Choose tab and hoping that that in some way would help them, they're clearly, those other projects are starting to bear fruit and they're starting to work. So customers online, those existing customers online, are finding the information they need a bit more than they were before.
Finally, coming on to an idea we introduced last time, but the idea of more considered customers. This trend continued to accelerate throughout the period, with 15% of customers now taking more than 4 minutes to complete the 15 gifts question journey. They're also the customers seeing the largest increase in conversion rate of any group of customers, with 91% increase in them converting.
And this again points to that sort of almost, certainly for the time being, permanent change in customer type. So again, even though the uniques generally have returned down, that continual increase in customers being far more cautious in their behaviour is a fascinating one.
And that continued to be seen in their purchasing habits as well, with a third of users now waiting more than a day after reaching their recommendation to make a purchase, a 46% increase on pre-COVID levels. And that's mirrored by a smaller proportion of customers making speedy decisions, with customers making a purchase within 30 minutes of reaching a recommendation, reducing to 30% of users. So moving on to looking a little closer at customers' needs. What we really noticed last time was that customers were buying very much in the moment, and that has continued in that we see customers reaching out for high data usage apps. But even there's some variation. Apps to entertain kids and apps for voice or video messaging have become very popular, whereas apps for gaming, or particularly apps for maps or GPS, have become far less common.
And this was the really key point, as Emily said last time, the fact that we saw without doubt that customers are buying in the moment. They're using today's restrictions in their decisions as their key decision drivers, even though they are signing up for quite often long-term contracts. And actually we're seeing across our partners, as things change, as requirements slightly change, that's being almost immediately translated into people's decision drivers. So we expect to see that trend being followed. People will buy long-term using absolutely today's situation as their key decision point.
When we last checked in looking at customers' decision drivers, we saw an 11% increase in customers saying that unlimited data had to be in their plan, a 6.6% increase in customers asking for 5G in their handsets, and a 4% increase in customers asking for their plan to feature mobile hotspots. 8 weeks later, and in the majority of cases, these uses have dropped back down to their normal levels, with unlimited data seeing a 1.8% increase versus pre-COVID, and 5G and mobile hotspots both seeing small declines. So just to summarise that section then, Firstly, customers are still reaching out for support. Even when stores are reopening in some places, they're still reaching out online for supporting their purchases. Secondly, the group of considered customers is still growing, and we're not seeing that slow. And thirdly, decisions are still being made in the moment, but that means that it's returned back to the new normal faster than most of the data we've seen. So the final section, how are customers' purchasing habits changing across the industry? So firstly, last time we recapped on this, we saw that customers were buying flagship phones in order to make sure that their needs were being met. What we've really seen over the course of the last 12 weeks is the UK and US industries reacting very differently. In the UK, the majority of consumers are favouring mid-range phones, with 39.1% of phones being purchased right now featuring in that mid-range category, a 14% increase since pre-COVID. The way that customers here are really managing their spend is opting for cheap recurring costs, so their tariff costs have become lower. In the US, we have seen a similar trend towards mid-range phones, with a 10% increase overall, but this has been far more influenced by external factors, with the COVID relief checks falling in the lockdown fatigue period, meaning that customers, for a short time, started buying into premium phones whilst they still had money in their pocket. So just to summarise that section then, firstly, customers are no longer trading up into premium phones. Customers in the UK are consistently buying into more mid-range phones, and they're also opting for cheaper plans. And finally, customers in the US did see a similar trend, but their behaviour is far more impacted by external factors.
And a fascinating thing here is that slow sort of consideration now coming into the spend. So whereas last time we were showing absolutely the customer is becoming more considered, they're looking for support more, but actually on the whole spend was, if anything, up, because we were saying this is the sort of product that they will always spend on, and actually will go on the safe side and buy premium or buy unlimited. We're now starting to slowly see the impacts of the whole economic downturn, perhaps even within the telco space, and that slightly more cautious outlook playing out in their spend as well. So thank you very much for joining for this quick update. We'll be doing a few more of these as we go through the next few weeks. We're obviously very keen now to understand what will happen in this new normal period. We've seen how certain trends are returning back, whereas other trends around being cautious, looking for support, and your needs changing seem to be persistent. So we'll now be monitoring this very closely, and we'll be checking in again in a few weeks once we see this next period of change. In the meantime, our customer squads are working closely with partners to implement a number of changes in the engine that cater for these changing trends that we're seeing. So do work with them and make sure they're built into your success plan. But thank you very much for joining.